There is something deeply strange about the fact that 4 teenage boys, working in secret dormitories and borrowed classrooms, managed to invent magical spells so sophisticated that adult wizards would spend decades failing to replicate them. You find yourself standing at the threshold of a mystery tonight, one written in invisible ink and hidden in the margins of wizarding history. And as you settle into the warmth of wherever you are resting, you begin to understand that this story has been waiting for someone curious enough to listen. The year is 1971, and somewhere in the Scottish Highlands, a castle older than memory itself welcomes 4 first-year students who do not yet know they will become legends, though one suspects James Potter had an inkling given his rather remarkable self-confidence, which some might generously describe as enthusiasm, and others might less generously describe as the personality of someone who has never been told no. You watch as these 4 young wizards, James Potter, Sirius Black, Remus Lupin, and Peter Pettigrew, begin their journey through Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, and you notice immediately that they are drawn to each other by forces more powerful than simple friendship. Forces that historians have long debated may involve ancient magical theory about compatible magical cores, though scholars remain divided on whether magical cores even exist in any measurable sense. In medieval Europe, particularly during the 13th century, secret societies of scholars often gathered in university towns like Oxford and Bologna to share forbidden knowledge, hiding their research from church authorities who viewed such investigations as dangerously close to heresy, and you recognize that the Marauders were continuing a tradition far older than they realized. What makes their story particularly fascinating, and this is a detail that often gets overlooked, is that the town of Godric's Hollow, where James Potter was born, sits atop what geomancers in the 1800s believed to be a convergence point of ley lines. Those theoretical channels of earth energy that some Victorian occultists mapped with obsessive precision, though modern magical archaeologists cannot agree on whether these maps meant anything at all. You smile as you imagine young Sirius Black arriving at Hogwarts, desperate to prove he was nothing like his pure-blood supremacist family, so desperate that he probably would have befriended a blast-ended Scroot if it had shown sufficient disdain for tradition. The lost spells of the Marauders represent something precious and irreplaceable, the creative genius of youth unconstrained by the limitations that experience teaches us to accept. You move forward in time now, drifting through the corridors of Hogwarts during those early years when the Marauders were still learning the basic curriculum, still struggling with potions essays and transfiguration practicals like any other students, though you noticed that their approach to magical education carried a distinctly experimental quality that their professors found either inspiring or terrifying, depending on the day. The first lost spells were not grand achievements, but small modifications, tiny adjustments to existing charms that made them work just slightly better for their specific purposes. And historians who study magical innovation have noted that this is precisely how real advancement happens. Not in dramatic breakthroughs, but in countless incremental improvements made by people too stubborn to accept that something cannot be done. You watch as James and Sirius spend hours in an unused classroom on the 4th floor, their wands tracing patterns in the air as they try to combine a basic revealing charm with a tracking spell, producing results that range from mildly impressive to, "We should probably not mention this to Madame Pomfrey." The Roman Empire maintained elaborate networks of message runners and signal fires to coordinate military operations across vast distances, and wizarding communities of that era developed their own parallel systems using enchanted objects that could convey simple messages across hundreds of miles, a tradition that the Marauders would eventually perfect in their own way. Here is something delightfully odd that you might not have considered. The original Hogwarts Charter of 990 CE included provisions for student experimentation that were so permissive they had to be quietly amended after a 1203 incident involving animated gargoyles that scholars still debate whether to classify as transfiguration gone wrong, or the first successful creation of artificial magical consciousness. Peter Pettigrew, often dismissed as the least talented of the group, actually contributed something essential during these early days, a patient willingness to test spells that James and Sirius had invented. which is either a testament to his loyalty or evidence that someone needed to explain laboratory safety protocols to this friend group. You settle deeper into the warmth surrounding you as the story takes its first truly dark turn, because the lost spells of the Marauders cannot be properly understood without examining the animagus transformation, that most dangerous and legally restricted branch of transfiguration that three 15-year-old boys decided to attempt in complete secrecy without adult supervision because their friend Remus Lupin was a werewolf and they refused to let him suffer alone. You feel the weight of that choice as you witness their decision-making process, recognizing that what the Marauders accomplished was not simply illegal, but spectacularly, almost unbelievably ambitious. The British Ministry of Magic records only 7 registered animagi in the entire 20th century, making the idea that 3 teenagers could achieve this transformation simultaneously almost laughable, except that they actually did it, which suggests either unprecedented magical talent or a fundamental misunderstanding of how probability works, and you suspect it was probably both. The process of becoming an animagus, as outlined in official ministry documentation, requires years of preparation, beginning with holding a single mandrake leaf in one's mouth for an entire month without swallowing or spitting it out, which presents obvious complications for eating, sleeping, talking in class, and literally any activity that involves being a normal human being. And you smile imagining James Potter trying to explain to Professor McGonagall why he was mumbling through her transfiguration lectures for 30 consecutive days. The historical record shows that the first documented animagus was Falco Essalon, an ancient Greek wizard who could transform into a falcon, and his writings, fragments of which survived in the Library of Alexandria before its destruction, describe the transformation as wearing the soul of another creature, like a second skin, language that magical theorists continue to debate as either poetic metaphor or literal description of a process we still do not fully understand. You watch as James, Sirius, and Peter gather the necessary components: the mandrake leaf, a silver teaspoon of dew collected from a place that neither sunlight nor human feet have touched for 7 days, the chrysalis of a death's head hawk moth, and one's own hair, all combined in a crystal phial and left in the darkest corner of one's dormitory until the next electrical storm, and you appreciate that this is essentially the magical equivalent of following a recipe you found on a very suspicious website while hoping you do not accidentally poison yourself. The lost spell component here, the innovation that has never been adequately documented, was whatever modification the Marauders made to the traditional meditation phase. Standard animagus training requires the practitioner to repeat the incantation Amato Animo Animato Animagus twice daily, once at sunrise and once at sunset, while holding their wand to their heart. But the Marauders apparently developed a synchronized variation that allowed them to support each other through the psychological strain of the transformation, a kind of magical buddy system that prevented any single practitioner from losing themselves in the animal consciousness. This innovation is particularly fascinating because it suggests an understanding of magical theory that should have been far beyond their years. Specifically, the concept that magic responds to intention and emotion as much as to proper incantation and wand movement. And scholars who study their achievement have proposed that the strength of their friendship literally made the spell work better than it would have for individuals working alone. Though this theory remains controversial because it implies that love functions as a measurable magical force. You pause to appreciate a genuinely strange historical detail. The death's head hawk moth required for the animagus transformation was considered so symbolically powerful in Victorian England that naturalists who studied it reported unusual occurrences in their laboratories, including spontaneous combustion of preserved specimens and recurring dreams of distant places, observations that were dismissed as fantasy at the time, but which some fringe magical historians now suggest may have been genuine magical phenomena caused by the insect's inherent mystical properties. James Potter became a stag, an animal whose symbolism stretches back through Celtic mythology to represent the wild spirit of the forest and the courage of the natural world. And while you might be tempted to make a joke about his choice reflecting his personality, specifically the part where stags are known for showing off during mating season, which tracks perfectly with everything we know about teenage James. You also recognize that animagus forms are not consciously chosen, but rather emerge from one's innermost nature, meaning the stag was simply who James was underneath all the bravado. Sirius Black became a dog large enough to control a werewolf, specifically something resembling a grim, that spectral black hound of British folklore that supposedly appears as an omen of death, and you cannot help but notice the bitter irony that Sirius would later be imprisoned for crimes he did not commit, partly because his animagus form looked exactly like a creature associated with evil and destruction. Peter Pettigrew became a rat, and while it is tempting to read this as foreshadowing of his eventual betrayal, the rat as symbol of cowardice and treachery, the more generous interpretation is that the form was practical, allowing Peter to press the knot on the whomping willow and create safe passage for his friends, proving that even the smallest among us can serve crucial purposes. The lost component of this spell, the piece that has never been recovered, was whatever mental technique the Marauders developed to maintain human consciousness while in animal form for extended periods, because standard animagus theory warns that spending too long as an animal can cause practitioners to forget their human selves. Yet the Marauders routinely spent entire nights running through the Forbidden Forest and apparently returned to human form without any lasting confusion, which either means they invented a genuine breakthrough in magical psychology, or they were simply too stubborn to let a little thing like potential permanent identity dissolution slow them down. You find yourself drawn now to the greatest magical achievement of the Marauders' career, the object that would survive them and outlive most of their other works. And as you imagine the worn parchment of the Marauders' map unfolding in Harry Potter's hands decades later, you begin to appreciate the staggering complexity of what these teenage wizards actually accomplished. The homunculus charm, which forms the heart of the map's functionality, is a spell so sophisticated that adult curse breakers employed by Gringotts have studied the map and failed to fully understand how it works, and you recognize that this failure is not due to any lack of expertise on their part, but rather because the Marauders invented something genuinely new, a magical technique that had no precedent in recorded history. The charm gets its name from medieval alchemical theory, specifically the concept of the homunculus, a miniature human being that alchemists like Paracelsus in the 16th century claimed could be created through various mystical processes involving human biological material and careful cultivation in specialized vessels. And while no actual homunculus was ever successfully created through these methods, the metaphor persisted in magical theory as a way of describing any enchantment that creates a simplified representation of a more complex living system. You smile at the delicious historical irony that Paracelsus, whose alchemical writings influenced the theoretical foundation of the homunculus charm, was reportedly such an unpleasant person that he was thrown out of nearly every university in Europe at some point during his career, proving that being brilliant and being likable are unfortunately not the same thing, a lesson that Severus Snape would have done well to internalize. The map's most impressive feature is not simply that it shows the location of every person in Hogwarts, but that it shows them in real time, updating constantly as hundreds of individuals move through the castle's corridors, staircases, secret passages, and hidden rooms, a level of simultaneous magical processing that some scholars have compared to the computational power of modern supercomputers, except achieved through pure enchantment with no mechanical components whatsoever. The lost spell elements here involve three distinct but interconnected enchantments that the Marauders apparently layered together. First, a tracking charm modified to detect magical signatures rather than physical objects. Second, a revealing charm that could penetrate most forms of concealment, including invisibility cloaks, disillusionment charms, and polyjuice potion. And third, a self-updating inscription spell that could translate the tracking data into tiny moving labels that displayed accurate names without any conscious direction from the map's creator. Each of these innovations would have been impressive on its own, but combining them into a single cohesive system required a level of magical engineering that historians continue to argue about, with some scholars suggesting the Marauders must have had access to restricted library materials or adult assistance. while others maintain that the achievement represents pure, undirected genius of the sort that occasionally emerges when exceptionally talented individuals are freed from conventional educational constraints. Here is a genuinely peculiar detail that rarely gets discussed. The Marauders map appears to know the true identity of individuals even when those individuals do not know their own true identities, as evidenced by the fact that Peter Pettigrew's name appeared on the map even when he was disguised as a rat named Scabbers, which suggests the homunculus charm detects something more fundamental than physical form or conscious self-identification, perhaps something like the soul itself, though magical theorists remain deeply divided on whether souls can be detected by any known spell. The Muggle world during the 1970s was experiencing its own revolution in mapping technology, with the first satellite-based positioning systems being developed for military applications that would eventually become the GPS technology now embedded in every smartphone. And you appreciate that the Marauders were essentially inventing a magical equivalent at roughly the same time. Complete strangers working on parallel solutions to the problem of knowing exactly where things are. The construction of the map apparently took the Marauders nearly 2 years to complete, an astonishing investment of time and magical energy that speaks to both their dedication and their perhaps slightly unhealthy obsession with avoiding getting caught during their nighttime adventures. Though in fairness, when your adventures involve escorting a werewolf through passages near sleeping students, a certain degree of paranoid preparation seems reasonable. You watch as James Potter contributes the theoretical framework, drawing on his pure-blood family's access to obscure magical texts. Sirius Black provides the practical spell work, his natural talent for complex enchantments, proving that all those generations of dark wizard breeding accidentally produced someone determined to use his gifts for mischief rather than malice. Remus Lupin applies his meticulous scholarly nature to testing and refining each component, catching errors that would have rendered the entire project useless. And Peter Pettigrew handles the actual cartography, his artistic skill evident in the beautiful calligraphy that would later taunt Severus Snape with such memorable insults. The map's ability to display Hogwarts' constantly shifting staircases and reconfigurable rooms suggests that the homunculus charm somehow interfaces with the castle's own magical consciousness. Yes, Hogwarts appears to be at least partially sentient, a detail that is terrifying if you think about it too carefully, raising questions about whether the Marauders intentionally designed this feature or simply stumbled upon it while trying to make their tracking spells more accurate. You allow a gentle smile to cross your face as you consider what may be the most purely entertaining aspect of the Marauders map: its remarkable capacity for targeted verbal abuse, demonstrated most memorably when Severus Snape attempted to unlock its secrets and received a series of increasingly creative insults from the map's magical consciousness. And I'm really curious, from which part of the world are you watching this video? Write your country in the comments. Let's see how far this little story has traveled. The insult incantations woven into the map represent a genuinely unusual application of magical theory, because while defensive enchantments that respond to unauthorized access are common enough, think of the protections on Gringotts vaults or the barriers around the Ministry of Magic's most sensitive departments. Creating an enchantment that can generate context-appropriate insults requires something approaching actual intelligence, which raises fascinating and somewhat disturbing questions about what exactly the Marauders put into their creation. You watch as the map responds to Snape's demand that it reveal its secrets by having Messrs. Moony, Wormtail, Padfoot, and Prongs each contribute a personalized comment about Snape's character, appearance, and personal hygiene, and you notice that each insult reflects the personality of its originator. Remus Lupin's contribution is relatively mild and almost polite in its dismissiveness. James Potter's is direct and confrontational. Sirius Black's is elaborate and theatrical, and Peter Pettigrew's is eager to agree with everyone else, which in retrospect seems like a character detail we all should have paid more attention to. The historical precedent for speaking magical objects stretches back to ancient civilizations across the world, from the talking statues of Egyptian temples that priests reportedly used to communicate divine messages to supplicants, to the Norse concept of the vulva, prophetic staffs that could speak wisdom to those who knew how to listen, and the Marauders were participating in this tradition while adding their own distinctly adolescent spin on the concept. The lost spell component that makes the insult function work is almost certainly some variant of the Protean charm combined with personality imprinting, a technique that appears in fragmentary form in certain medieval grimoires, but was never fully developed because, honestly, why would anyone need to create an enchanted object capable of crafting personalized mockery? And some scholars have suggested that the Marauders accidentally created a primitive form of magical artificial intelligence, though this interpretation remains controversial and is rejected by most mainstream magical theorists who believe the map's responses are pre-programmed rather than genuinely spontaneous. Here is a delightfully strange detail that connects to broader magical history. There exists in the archives of the Bulgarian Ministry of Magic a 15th-century enchanted mirror that allegedly insults anyone who looks into it while harboring dishonest intentions, and while no direct connection to the Marauders' work can be established. The similarity in function suggests that perhaps they were unconsciously drawing on a deeper tradition of what we might call sarcastic enchantment, a school of magical practice that apparently appeals to a certain type of personality across all cultures and eras. The map's ability to identify Snape specifically as someone deserving of mockery, rather than simply insulting anyone who tries to access it without proper authorization, implies that the insult function incorporates some of the same identity recognition magic as the homunculus charm, meaning the map can not only find everyone in Hogwarts, but can also judge whether they deserve to be mocked, which is simultaneously impressive and slightly concerning from an ethical standpoint. You chuckle softly, imagining the Marauders spending hours crafting and testing various insult formulations, debating which epithets were most likely to infuriate their least favorite professor, and you recognize that this is exactly the kind of project that teenage boys with too much talent and too little supervision would inevitably undertake. The specific charm work involved in making text appear on parchment in response to verbal commands is actually well documented. Quick quotes. Quills use similar principles, but the innovation here lies in making that text responsive to context, capable of being witty rather than merely reactive. And while the Marauders would certainly have found it hilarious that their creation continued insulting Snape years after they had all left Hogwarts, there is something slightly melancholy about an enchantment that preserves forever the petty conflicts of adolescence. The map apparently includes insult protocols for multiple individuals beyond Snape, suggesting that the Marauders prepared personalized responses for various authority figures they anticipated might try to access their creation, which means somewhere in the map's enchantment, there may be unused insult sequences for Argus Filch, Horace Slughorn, and possibly even Albus Dumbledore, though the map has never been tested against anyone who might trigger those particular responses. You notice that the tone of the map's insults, while certainly mean-spirited, stops short of genuine cruelty. The mockery targets Snape's behavior and pretensions rather than aspects of his identity he cannot control, which suggests that even at their most petty, the Marauders maintained certain ethical boundaries, or at least James Potter did by this point in his development, since we know from other sources that his behavior toward Snape in earlier years was considerably less restrained. You feel yourself sinking deeper into comfort as the story turns to perhaps the most practically useful of the Marauders' lost spells, the communication magic they developed to coordinate their activities across the vast and labyrinthine space of Hogwarts Castle. Because plotting mischief is considerably more difficult when your co-conspirators are in different towers, and you cannot simply text them to confirm the plan. The challenge of instant magical communication had occupied wizarding minds for centuries, and while methods like Patronus messaging, two-way mirrors, and enchanted coins would eventually become more widely known, the Marauders apparently developed their own proprietary system during their Hogwarts years that combined elements of several existing techniques into something uniquely suited to their needs. Silent, untraceable, and capable of conveying complex information rather than simple signals. You watch as Sirius Black, whose family's ancient library contained magical texts dating back to the founding of Wizarding Britain, adapts a technique originally designed for coordinating pure-blood social events into something far more useful, specifically a set of linked parchment scraps that could display messages written on any of their partner documents, essentially inventing magical group chat approximately 20 years before Muggle teenagers would experience the same capability through mobile phones. The historical fact that makes this achievement even more impressive is that the Roman military used remarkably sophisticated communication systems, including fire signals, messenger riders, and even a primitive semaphore network along their borders, and magical communities of that era developed parallel systems using enchanted objects called speaking stones that could transmit emotional impressions if not actual words, meaning the Marauders were solving a problem that had challenged organized groups since the dawn of civilization. There is a genuinely odd footnote to this history. In 1847, a French magical researcher named Célestine Beaumont claimed to have invented a system of enchanted butterflies that could carry thoughts between distant parties, and while her work was dismissed by the magical establishment of her time as impractical, some contemporary scholars have suggested that Beaumont's principles may have influenced later developments in magical communication, though the connection remains a matter of scholarly debate. The specific lost spell that the Marauders contributed to this tradition appears to be something called the echoing inscription charm, at least according to certain fragmentary references in later documents, which allowed anything written on one surface to simultaneously appear on linked surfaces without requiring the writer to cast a separate spell for each transmission, an elegant solution that would have been particularly useful for coordinating activities during moments when elaborate spellcasting might attract unwanted attention. You smile imagining the Marauders passing notes during History of Magic, a class so notoriously boring that students had reportedly developed entire card games to play under their desks, while Professor Binns droned on about goblin rebellions, using enchanted parchment that allowed them to plan that evening's adventures, while appearing to take diligent notes on the Treaty of 1289. The communication system they developed had to solve several specific problems. It needed to work across the substantial distances within Hogwarts, including through stone walls and magical barriers. It needed to be immune to interception by professors or prefects. It needed to leave no permanent evidence that could be discovered later. And ideally, it needed to work even when one or more participants was in animal form, since 3 of the 4 Marauders regularly transformed into creatures lacking opposable thumbs. The solution apparently involved combining the linked parchment concept with some form of mental projection, allowing the animagus Marauders to send simple impressions, warnings, directional information, emotional states, even while transformed, which represents a significant theoretical advance over standard magical communication techniques that require verbal or written input. You pause to appreciate a particularly clever detail. The Marauders apparently designed their communication system to automatically destroy messages after they had been read by all intended recipients, leaving no paper trail that could be discovered during dormitory inspections or accidental dropped parchment incidents. A level of operational security that suggests either genuine paranoia or the kind of planning that comes from having been caught and punished enough times to learn from experience. The lost spells in this category also included what appears to be an early prototype of the technique Hermione Granger would later use on Dumbledore's army coins: the ability to change a physical object in a way that alerts other holders of linked objects to check for messages, suggesting that either Hermione independently reinvented the Marauders' technique or that the general principle had made its way into magical knowledge through channels we cannot trace. The communication magic was particularly important during the full moon nights when Remus transformed, because coordinating the movements of a werewolf, a stag, a dog, and a rat through the Forbidden Forest required constant awareness of each other's positions and any approaching dangers, and you recognize that the playful tone of the Marauders' reputation often obscures how genuinely dangerous their activities were and how much careful planning went into keeping everyone alive through experiences that could easily have ended in tragedy. You breathe slowly and evenly as the narrative approaches the subject of protection and defense, because the lost spells of the Marauders included an entire category of enchantments designed specifically to keep 4 teenage boys safe during activities that by all reasonable standards should have killed them multiple times over, and you begin to understand that beneath all the mischief and humor lay a core of genuine danger that required genuine magical countermeasures. The monthly adventures with Remus Lupin during his werewolf transformations presented challenges that no standard Hogwarts education could have prepared them for. A werewolf's strength exceeds that of any normal human. Its speed surpasses most magical creatures, and its violence during transformation is essentially uncontrollable, meaning that even with the presence of large animagus forms to distract and redirect its attention, the risk of serious injury or death was constant and real. You watch as James Potter, whose father worked for the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, adapts techniques from Auror training manuals into something more suited to their specific situation, not spells designed to capture or kill a dark wizard, but rather enchantments intended to redirect and calm a creature that was, after all, their friend trapped in a monstrous form. The mainstream historical fact that illuminates this section is that medieval European wizards developed elaborate protocols for dealing with werewolf outbreaks in their communities, including containment wards, calming drafts, and in extreme cases lethal force. But the Marauders' approach was fundamentally different, because their goal was not to control or neutralize the werewolf, but to accompany it, to provide company and direction during the worst hours of Remus's monthly curse, which required an entirely different magical philosophy. Here is a genuinely strange piece of fringe magical history. Certain 19th century werewolf researchers, particularly the eccentric Bavarian wizard Heinrich Wolfram, believed that werewolves retained fragments of human consciousness during transformation if they were exposed to certain plant essences before the full moon, and while Wolfram's research was largely discredited after his death in an unrelated cauldron explosion, some of his ideas about werewolf psychology appear in Remus Lupin's own later writings on the subject, suggesting the Marauders may have incorporated elements of this fringe theory into their protective strategies. The specific lost spells in this category appear to have included what later researchers have tentatively labeled directional impulse enchantments, subtle magical nudges that could influence a werewolf's movement without triggering the aggressive resistance that more forceful control magic would provoke, allowing the animagus Marauders to guide Remus away from the castle and any sleeping students without provoking a violent confrontation. You recognize that this is an area where scholarly debate remains particularly active, because some theorists argue that no spell can influence a transformed werewolf's behavior given their well-documented resistance to magic, while others point to the Marauders' documented success in managing Remus's transformations for years without any serious incidents as evidence that they must have developed some effective technique, even if we cannot reconstruct exactly what it was. The defensive enchantments also had to account for the Forbidden Forest itself, which contains creatures far more dangerous than a single werewolf. Acromantulas with their paralyzing venom and taste for human flesh, centaurs who did not take kindly to trespassers in their territory, and according to some accounts, things even darker that lurked in the deepest parts of the forest, where no sane person would venture, except apparently 4 teenage boys on a regular basis. Sirius Black's contribution to the defensive spell array appears to have drawn on his family's extensive knowledge of dark magic, which he repurposed toward protective rather than offensive ends, a fitting irony that the ancient and terrible Black family library ended up protecting a werewolf and his friends rather than hunting them. You smile at the thought of Sirius learning counter curses from tomes his ancestors intended for much darker purposes, essentially stealing his family's legacy and using it to build something good, which is perhaps the most Sirius Black thing imaginable. The lost spells included emergency protocols as well, predetermined magical signals that would alert the others if any Marauder found themselves in immediate danger. automatic defensive wards that could be triggered by specific movements or sounds, and according to fragmentary references in later documents, some kind of emergency port key or transportation spell that could extract a wounded companion if absolutely necessary, though this last element remains speculative because no physical evidence of such an object has ever been found. Peter Pettigrew's role in the defensive system was primarily reconnaissance. His small rat form could scout ahead, identify potential threats, and warn the others before dangerous encounters occurred, which meant that much of the Marauders' safety depended on his alertness and loyalty, a detail that becomes tragically ironic in light of his later betrayal. The Marauders apparently also developed spells to cover their tracks after each adventure, both literally and figuratively. Enchantments that would erase paw prints and other physical evidence of their passage, charms that would disperse any lingering magical signatures that a skilled tracker might detect, and memory modifications that could blur the recollections of any house elves or ghosts who might have witnessed them.
You let your eyes grow heavy as the story reaches the question of passwords and verification magic. Those elegant little spells that determined who could access the Marauder's map, and who would be met with nothing but blank parchment and eventual insult, because the phrase, "I solemnly swear that I am up to no good," was never just words, but rather a sophisticated magical key that the Marauders crafted with considerable care. The concept of verbal passwords in magic stretches back to the earliest recorded spellwork, when ancient Mesopotamian wizards believed that speaking the true name of a thing granted power over it, and the Marauders were working within this tradition while adding their own characteristically irreverent twist by making their password an admission of mischievous intent rather than a noble declaration or secret phrase. You watch as Remus Lupin, whose academic approach to magic made him the natural choice for working out the theoretical underpinnings, develops the password system by combining elements of oath magic with verification charms, creating a spell that did not simply recognize certain words but actually tested whether the speaker genuinely meant what they were saying, a lie detector for intent rather than truthfulness. The mainstream historical context here involves the development of magical contracts and binding oaths during the medieval period, particularly the unbreakable vow and its less lethal cousins, which established that spoken words could carry genuine magical weight if combined with appropriate enchantments, and the Marauders' innovation was making this verification process instantaneous and automatic, rather than requiring elaborate ritual preparation. Here is a curious historical footnote that few people know. The phrase "mischief managed," which deactivates the map, may have been borrowed from a much older magical tradition. Victorian-era British wizards apparently used similar phrases to conclude formal magical workings, with mischief being a somewhat archaic term for any unofficial magical activity, making the Marauders' choice of words more historically grounded than it might initially appear, though the precise chain of transmission remains a matter of scholarly speculation. The lost spell component here is the intent verification charm itself, which appears to work by reading the emotional state and genuine purpose of the speaker, rather than merely detecting specific words, because we know the map did not activate for Severus Snape, even when he spoke words demanding it reveal its secrets, implying that the password system measured something more subtle than vocabulary. You chuckle softly imagining the Marauders testing various password phrases before settling on their final choice. No doubt there were rejected options involving more explicit profanity, inside jokes that would have been incomprehensible to anyone else, and possibly passwords so embarrassing that even decades later, the surviving Marauders would never admit they had been considered. The closing phrase, "mischief managed," served a different function than the opening password, not verifying intent, but rather activating a concealment charm that returned the map to its innocent blank parchment state. And the elegance of this design, a matched pair of phrases that bookended each use of the map, reflects the kind of aesthetic sensibility that separates truly masterful magical craftsmanship from mere functional spellwork. The password system had to be robust against various potential attacks. Someone might try to force a legitimate user to activate the map, requiring the spell to somehow distinguish between genuine intent and coerced speech. Someone might try to trick the map by speaking the password while intending something other than mischief, requiring the spell to evaluate sincerity at a deep level. And someone might try to circumvent the password entirely through other magical means, requiring the concealment charm to resist sophisticated counterspells. You notice that the Marauders apparently built in exceptions to their own security system, because Harry Potter was able to use the map without difficulty, despite never having received explicit instruction in its use, suggesting either that the password magic recognized him as a worthy successor, or that the map itself retained enough of James Potter's personality to approve of his son's adventures. The phrase structure itself, declarative rather than imperative, personal rather than objective, may have contributed to the spell's effectiveness by requiring speakers to commit themselves emotionally to the statement rather than merely pronouncing ritual syllables, and some magical linguists have suggested that this approach to password design represents a genuine theoretical advance over traditional phrase-based security enchantments. Scholars continue to debate whether the Marauders invented this approach independently or adapted it from some earlier source that has since been lost, with some arguing that the sophistication of the verification magic points to outside influence, while others maintain that 4 exceptionally talented teenagers working collaboratively could plausibly have achieved such results through experimentation and ingenuity alone. You float now in a space between waking and dreaming, as the story reaches its most shadow-touched territory. The memory manipulation and concealment magic that allowed 4 students to conduct illegal activities for years without ever being definitively caught by the formidable authority figures, who should have noticed that something deeply unusual was happening in Gryffindor Tower. The Marauders maintained their secret successfully throughout their entire Hogwarts career, despite the presence of Albus Dumbledore, widely considered the greatest wizard of the age, and despite regular interaction with Minerva McGonagall, whose animagus registration and sharp observational skills should have made her uniquely qualified to detect unregistered animagus activity, which suggests either remarkable luck or remarkably sophisticated concealment magic. You watch as the 4 young wizards develop an integrated system of protective enchantments around their activities, layering concealment upon concealment until the truth of what they were doing became almost impossible to detect through conventional means. And you recognize that this level of magical paranoia and preparation reflects both their genuine fear of discovery and their somewhat excessive enjoyment of elaborate plotting. The mainstream historical fact here is that memory modification magic has existed since ancient times, with the earliest recorded obliviations appearing in Egyptian magical texts dating to approximately 2000 BCE. Originally developed to protect the secrecy of magical communities from Muggle awareness, and the Marauders were essentially adapting these techniques for a new purpose, protecting teenage mischief rather than civilizational secrets, which is either an amusing debasement of ancient tradition or a charming demonstration of how magic evolves through practical application depending on your perspective. There is a deeply strange piece of fringe magical history that connects to this discussion. In 1923, a French occultist named Marcel Dupont published a treatise claiming that sufficiently intense experiences create memory anchors that resist magical modification, and while his work was largely ignored by the mainstream magical community, certain researchers have noted that the Marauders' adventures were certainly intense enough to create such anchors, raising questions about how they concealed memories that should theoretically have resisted concealment, unless they developed some technique for working around or with these anchors rather than against them. The specific lost spells in this category appear to have included a variant of the Confundus charm, designed for long-term effect rather than momentary confusion, capable of making observers consistently fail to notice suspicious patterns that should have attracted attention, such as 4 students regularly disappearing on the same nights each month or returning to their dormitory at unusual hours with mysterious injuries. You smile at the thought of Professor McGonagall, one of the most observant witches in Britain, repeatedly failing to connect obvious dots because the Marauders had enchanted her perception without her knowledge, which is either evidence of their magical skill or an indication that even the greatest wizards have blind spots when it comes to students they genuinely like. The concealment system the Marauders developed appears to have worked on multiple levels. There were active spells designed to redirect attention in the moment, passive enchantments that made certain memories blur or fade over time, and perhaps most impressively, some technique for making authority figures unconsciously rationalize away observations that should have raised immediate alarms. Scholarly debate continues about whether the Marauders actually used memory modification on their professors or simply relied on perception-altering charms that prevented accurate observations from forming in the first place, a distinction that might seem technical but carries significant ethical implications. Modifying someone's memories is a profound violation of their mental autonomy, while merely preventing them from noticing something is arguably more defensible though still problematic. Peter Pettigrew's later ability to live for 12 years as a rat without detection suggests that at least some of the Marauders' concealment magic remained with him after their Hogwarts days, raising the disturbing question of whether the techniques they developed for hiding teenage adventures were later repurposed for hiding from justice, which adds a bitter undertone to what might otherwise be a story of harmless ingenuity. The lost spells also included techniques for concealing their animagus activities specifically. Since unregistered animagus transformation carries serious legal penalties, and detection would have meant not just school punishment but ministry involvement, and you recognize that the Marauders were not merely hiding mischief, but hiding crimes, which required a level of magical sophistication that few adult wizards possess. You pause to consider the ethical weight of what the Marauders accomplished. Their concealment magic was used primarily for benevolent purposes, protecting their friend Remus from discovery and punishment, for a condition he never chose, but the techniques themselves were morally neutral and could be applied to far darker ends, a reminder that magical innovation always carries the potential for misuse. The irony is that despite all their precautions, the Marauders' greatest secret was eventually revealed not through any failure of their concealment magic, but through deliberate betrayal by one of their own. Peter Pettigrew's decision to join Voldemort, rendering all their careful spell work irrelevant because no enchantment can protect against treachery from within.
You breathe deeply now as the story begins its gentle descent toward sleep, feeling the weight of these lost spells settling around you like a comfortable blanket woven from decades of magical innovation and teenage brilliance. And you understand that what the Marauders created was never meant to last forever, but rather to serve its moment and then fade into legend. The castle grows quiet in your imagination, its corridors empty of hurrying students and patrolling professors, its portraits dozing in their frames, its ghosts drifting through walls on errands that need not concern the living. And somewhere in that peaceful darkness, the echoes of 4 young wizards still linger, preserved not in any spell or enchantment, but in the stories that continue to be told. You watch as the Marauder's map lies folded and dormant in some drawer or pocket, its parchment blank to casual observers, its secrets waiting patiently for the next worthy soul to speak the proper words with genuine mischievous intent. And you recognize that some magic is designed to outlive its creators, while other magic is meant to be discovered, used, and forgotten until the world needs it again. The mainstream historical legacy of the Marauders extends beyond their specific spell innovations to include a broader influence on how young wizards think about magical possibility. Their example demonstrates that the curriculum taught in schools represents only a fraction of what magic can accomplish, and that genuine advancement often comes from those willing to experiment outside official channels. Here is one final strange historical footnote to carry into your dreams. The Department of Mysteries reportedly maintains a collection of self-updating documents that continue to generate new content despite their creators having died centuries ago, and some researchers have speculated that the Marauders map may eventually qualify for inclusion in this collection if it continues functioning long enough, meaning the teenage pranks of 4 Gryffindor boys might someday be preserved alongside the most mysterious magical artifacts in Britain. The lost spells of the Marauders remind us that magic, like all creative endeavors, flourishes best in the space between formal instruction and wild experimentation, between the rules we are taught and the possibilities we imagine, and that sometimes the most profound innovations come from people who simply refuse to accept that something cannot be done. You feel your thoughts growing softer now, less focused, more willing to drift along currents of image and sensation rather than following the rigid pathways of narrative logic. And this is as it should be, because the best stories do not end so much as they fade, leaving us in a comfortable space between the tale and the telling. Scholars continue to debate whether the Marauders' lost spells can ever truly be reconstructed, or whether they represent a unique convergence of talent, friendship, and circumstance that cannot be replicated. But perhaps the answer matters less than the question itself, less than the reminder that magic continues to hold mysteries worth pursuing. The stag, the dog, the rat, and the wolf run forever through forests of memory, their paws leaving no prints on paths that exist only in imagination, their adventures continuing in spaces beyond the reach of waking thought, and you are welcome to follow them if you wish, to join that eternal moonlit chase through shadows and starlight. The Marauder's map folds itself closed in your mind's eye, its parchment returning to innocent blankness, its secrets preserved for another night and another story. And the words appear softly at the bottom of your fading vision. Mischief managed, mischief managed, mischief gently, peacefully, completely managed, and you drift now into the warm darkness where all the lost spells still work perfectly, where friendship lasts forever, and where every adventure ends safely in the soft embrace of sleep.